Welcome back to America Decides. Federal Judge Tanya Chutkan is allowing former President Trump more time to respond to Jack Smith's unsealed filing, which was such a big part of our conversation here yesterday. Former president has until November 7th to respond. That's, of course, just 2 days after Election Day. In Smith's 165-page document, the special counsel attempts to make the case that Trump's actions were as a private citizen, not a sitting president, and therefore not shielded by immunity provided to the president and the presidency in a recent Supreme Court decision. One of the allegations made in that filing is that the former president replied by saying, quote, "So what?" when informed that his vice president, Mike Pence, could quite probably be in danger inside the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. David Becker joins me now here at the table. He is CBS News election law contributor and the executive director of the Center for Election Innovation and Research, and, importantly, my co-author on this very fine book, The Big Truth, Upholding Democracy in the Age of the Big Lie. David, great to see you. So I want to, for the audience's benefit, read something that from the very early part of Jack Smith's filing. Quote, "His scheme was fundamentally a private one. Working with a team of private co-conspirators, the defendant, that means former President Trump, acted as a candidate when he pursued multiple criminal means to disrupt, through fraud and deceit, the government function by which votes are collected and counted." Listen to this. "A function in which the defendant, as president, had no official role." That puts it into a nice little nutshell, does it not?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you haven't read it, it's a good read. Read the 165-page motion. What they're talking about there is that the president, as the chief executive of the United States, has actually no role in elections and certainly no role in a presidential election in which he's a candidate. There's no role for the president to oversee electoral votes. In fact, the Constitution expressly gives that to the vice president, not the president himself. And
the Constitution gives to the states the authority to conduct its elections and be the certifying agent in communication with the Congress and the National Archives.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so when you look at the president's actions at the time, former President Trump, what he's doing is he's engaging often with campaign staff or private staff, counsel like Rudy Giuliani, Cleta Mitchell, Sidney Powell, who had no role in the White House, who were campaign staff, or in some cases, even in the case of Sidney Powell, had no relation to the campaign either, who were just private citizens. And in that kind of role, they were serving his role as office seeker, not office holder, and they make that distinction.
And as you read the special counsel's filing, it also sheds light on this assertion that has been made with some frequency by those who defend former President Trump's actions. He was merely asking questions, inquiring on behalf of the country writ large about how well this election was conducted. That's not what the filing says.
No, the filing is very, very clear that he was trying to use his role as office holder, as the president, to kind of bully states to serve him as office seeker as a presidential candidate. And it's really remarkable when you look at all of the things he was saying and doing. It tells a very, very disturbing timeline from even pre-election, where he was setting the stage to claim the election was stolen as early as the summer of 2020. And what's somewhat chilling is seeing how much some of those claims echo what he's saying right now and in the earlier months of the 2024 campaign.
David, speaking about right now, there's a woman in Colorado named Tina Peters who was sentenced today. Explain to the audience who Tina Peters is and how her case highlights or illustrates some of the things that were asserted about the 2020 election and have been tested in court, and now a verdict has been rendered against a woman like Tina Peters who brought those accusations.
So in the thousands of election jurisdictions in our country and the hundreds of thousands of professional election workers in our country, it's remarkable that amidst all the pressure and lies about the 2020 election, only a tiny handful of them succumbed to those lies and engaged in some of the distortion of our legitimate election process. Tina Peters is one of those people. Tina Peters is a clerk in the western part of Colorado in Mesa County who succumbed to the disinformation, who saw an opportunity to gain fame amongst a certain group of people who also were disappointed in the election, and who importantly gave unauthorized and illegal access to voting machines and equipment to people like Mike Lindell and his supporters in the aftermath of the 2020 election. She was found guilty in a Colorado state court in Mesa County, Colorado. She was prosecuted by Republican district attorneys there, and her sentencing just happened today. And she was, after a long sentencing hearing where she was given about 45 minutes to just openly speak to the court, she was given 9 years of imprisonment, which most of us who have been watching this thought was entirely appropriate, given her unusual behavior and the way she embraced her role flying on private jets with Mike Lindell and others in the course of the aftermath of the 2020 election.
Very quickly, David, the storm, Helene, North Carolina, Georgia, what impact, if any, will it have on the ability of voters to participate, have their votes cast and counted?
Well, particularly in North Carolina, they're still assessing it. It's about 24 counties in the western part of the state. They're still trying to dig out from the flooding and everything that's happening. They think they're going to have a good idea of that later this week. But election officials have dealt with these kinds of things before, although Helene was particularly rough on western North Carolina. They've got some time to fix this. They'll likely consolidate some precincts for people who lost their mail ballots or need a duplicate ballot. They'll get a new one. That means their other ballot will be invalidated. Every voter only gets one valid ballot at any given point in time. Both North Carolina and Georgia have established websites for people who want information that are specific to the devastation related to Hurricane Helene. So election officials are on top of this. It's going to be particularly hard for North Carolina, but I have a lot of confidence in those folks.
Key phrase, election officials are on top of this, as they always are. David Becker, thank you very much.
Thank you, Major.